Hi, everyone. Welcome. Dimpna, we're still waiting. Many people have joined, but I'm sure a few more will join, but maybe I can turn it over to you to get started.
Great. Thank you, Samiksha. Welcome, everybody, to the webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining. My name is Dimpna van der Land, and I am the CEO of the Clean Cooking Alliance. The Clean Cooking Alliance launched the System Strategy Initiative after extensive stakeholder consultations suggested that the ecosystem could benefit from a shared strategy and action plan. CCA made a commitment to steward this process forward broader ecosystem. We see this very much as a public good and as a rare opportunity.
Dimpna, we are losing you a bit. Are you still with us? Well, I wonder if while we wait to see if Dimpna might come back, maybe I can share again that we're very excited about this important milestone for the process. We're very excited to be sharing with you the progress that we've made to date over the last several months, developing the framework of the system strategy. And as we are at another important inflection point, the last time we had a webinar was a transition point as well. And now we're getting ready to transition to the third and final phase of the strategy development, which really involves building, iterating, and co-creating essentially some of the calls to action and calls to investment that we hope will really bring the strategy to life. Oh, Dimpna, you're back. Perfect. Oh, you can't hear us. Okay. Well, while we sort out some of those technical issues, maybe I can you hear us now?
I can hear you. I'm so sorry. I just totally got kicked out of the system.
Technology.
I know.
So
I know.
Over to you. You were just saying we were stewarding this process.
Yeah, and so we're super excited because today we will share the latest outputs of this ongoing and dynamic effort, the System Strategy Framework, that includes a set of initiatives for immediate action and investments. This strategy framework, which has been drafted with extensive stakeholder input and support, provides a shared vision for collective action. We are now transitioning into the final phase, focused on launching some of the initiatives identified in the strategy framework. There is still more to do to finalize the strategy framework and more to come of the strategy itself. We do not envision a final report, but rather we want to focus on the actionable initiatives instead. We do hope to share out more details of the deep analysis and thinking that underpins the strategy framework that we will present today. The initiatives we're going to share with you today are starting points, focused specifically on the set of investments and actions that can accelerate progress towards universal access. While we will not have time to share this today, there are longer-term ambitions, including how we might think about transforming the ecosystem so that organizations like CCA are no longer needed over time in favor of a new dynamic. The strategy is meant to be expansive. It isn't simply focused on one area or issue, such as financing, but on all the components of a well-functioning ecosystem that can deliver meaningful progress. It's also meant to be targeted and practical by identifying action and investment opportunities that can help accelerate progress. This process is already yielding exciting results for the clean cooking ecosystem. The systems strategy has helped shape and serve as an input to some defining global moments happening this year. CCA is committed to our stewardship role and providing the leadership and resources necessary to bring the system strategy from paper to practice. But I would also like to take this opportunity to issue an invitation to the wider ecosystem to engage and take action in support of the strategy. We all have a role to play and value to add, and ultimately, success is about bringing these initiatives into existence, which requires greater collective action and collaboration. CCA will continue to support and steward the final phase of the system strategy and is committed to putting forward the resources to help stand up or launch some of the initiatives that have been articulated in the strategy. But to truly have the strategy come to life, we'll need engagement from the whole system, from all of us. There are many ways to do this, and it doesn't always require resources. It could be as simple as using the language and structure of the framework in how you think about your own organization's mission and priorities, or more formally leading or supporting specific initiatives as we start launching. I'm excited about what is ahead and about collectively increasing our actions and ambitions. I'll hand it back to the strategy team, and I'm excited for them to share out what we've learned so far and where we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dimna. That's excellent. I would like to take a moment now just to run through the agenda. We have a little less than 90 minutes, and we have quite a bit we want to get through. So what we're going to start with is a bit more detail on the journey we've taken thus far through this work over the last several months. We'll then move on to an overview of the strategy framework. As Dimna said, there is a lot of thinking and analysis and many consultations that went into developing the framework. We hope to shed some light on that and share some of kind of the key and exciting insights. But we also hope over the next several months that we can go into more detail and share more of the actual strategy components and what lies behind them. We will then focus on some of the initiatives that Dimna alluded to. There's a list of initiatives that we see as starting points for implementing the strategy. We plan to take a rolling and phased approach, focusing on building them out, iterating them with partners, with stakeholders, and we will focus on a few initiatives at a time before moving on. And we're excited to share some of that with you today. We'll then move on to a look ahead, a description of some of the next steps and what we envision for the next weeks and months. And finally, we will conclude by hearing some reflections from Wanjira Mathai, who's joined us here today, and we're very excited that she has and that she'll be sharing her perspectives. And then Dimna will wrap us up with a few of our calls to action and the vision we have and the ambitions we have for the way forward. I'd also like to share a few housekeeping notes. As you may be aware, we are recording the session today. Even though we have quite a few participants on the line, we received an outpouring of interest for those who wanted to join but were unable to. So we hope that by sharing the recording, all of those people are able to learn and hear the overview from today. We also would like to encourage you to share any questions you have in the chat function. We will try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. And then finally, we have a bit of an ask for you, and Lindsay will share a little bit more detail about that ask towards the end, but we have a survey that we'd like to share as an invitation to all of you to share your inputs with us as we plan the next phase of work and the way forward, to highlight organizations you think we should be engaging, initiatives we should be building on. And we really do hope that each of you will fill this out and share your feedback with us and your reflections and your input into the next phase of work. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce who we have here on the webinar today. You heard from Dimna van der Lans, the CEO of the Clean Cooking Alliance. As I mentioned, we're very excited to also have Wanjira Mathai. Wanjira is the VP and Regional Director of Africa at the World Resource Institute. She's a supporter of CCA and a champion for clean cooking, and we are delighted to have her. We also have several representatives from Dalberg. Dalberg has been along the journey with CCA, helping us in our role as stewards of developing the system strategy. From Dalberg, we have Warren Ahubin, Michael San, and Lindsay Barone. All three of them have been deeply engaged from the very start of this process. And then finally, from CCA, this project sits with the strategy and development team at CCA, and we have representatives from that team as well, my colleague Sonia Hiles and myself, Samik Shanayer. So please, these are the people you should be reaching out to in the months and weeks ahead, and so we're very excited to hear from you, and we're delighted that you're joining us today. Next, I think I would just like to share a little bit about the journey that we're following. From its inception, we understood that developing an ecosystem-wide strategy was an ambitious undertaking. We felt from the start that the process of actually developing the strategy was equally important to the strategy itself. And we hoped that by following a very consultative approach, or an approach that was really about co-creation and building the strategy with partners and stakeholders, that the end product would be more valuable, would reflect the priorities of the ecosystem, and would encourage others to join us as co-implementers of the strategy. As Dimpna said, CCA understands and knows that we can't do this alone, and we've been very appreciative of the wealth of support and input and enthusiasm we've received to date in terms of people building this with us. And we really are excited that that will continue in the weeks and months ahead. For those that might not be aware, the process that we followed follows 3 phases. The first phase was about really understanding the ecosystem today. Through a number of consultations, we tried to identify some of the core challenges or dysfunctions that the current clean cooking ecosystem is facing, key opportunities and the dynamic across them, the key drivers, and how we could build more virtuous cycles and dismantle some vicious cycles so that we can allow the strategy that's to come to really be embraced by the ecosystem and anticipate how it can take it forward. We then shifted to phase 2, which was very much about incorporating the insights from the first phase and building out a future ambition, an ambition that was anchored on a few North Stars that we iterated on and then built out the structure of the actual strategy. Our colleagues, Oren and Lindsay, will take us through that structure in a few moments, but that brings us to where we are today, which is setting up and planning for the final phase of work of the strategy development, which we have termed early implementation. Our goal in that, as Dimpna alluded to, is to really try to see how we can make the strategy actionable and how we can bring some of these initiatives to life. There are a number of initiatives, and each of them will look and feel quite different, as will the process of bringing them to life. It'll very much be defined by those who engage and kind of put their hands up as co-implementers. And we're very excited to begin that. And again, we hope that you'll fill out the survey at the end of this webinar so that we can include your thoughts as we go about that planning. And then perhaps without any further ado, I can turn it over to Lindsay to share a bit more about the strategy framework itself. Oh, actually, I think I have one more point of discussion before I turn it over. We also wanted to share a little bit about stakeholder engagement to date. You heard from Dimpna that we've tried to be very consultative. We know we can't possibly speak with everyone, but we have strived to include diverse perspectives, those that consider themselves and have been essential to the clean cooking community and issue, those voices from adjacent spaces, industries, sectors. We've tried to include divergent perspectives as well as representative voices. And so we've had over 100 discussions. Many of those discussions have had multiple touch points and multiple conversations with the same people. We also, at the end of phase 1, wanted to share our insights and findings publicly and very broadly. So we had a couple webinars. And then we also engaged people through email and through a public survey. We hope to continue with that process in phase 3. And while we know we can't possibly, especially during COVID, engage everyone we hope to engage, this is a journey. And while the development is a very key part of that journey, it will be ongoing. And as Dimpna mentioned, I think CCA is very committed to its role as a steward of this. And not only to engage people in phase 3 of this process, but to continue to engage and broker new partnerships and bring in new voices and elevate those voices that maybe have been less active. So now, maybe I can turn it over to Lindsay to share a little bit about the framework itself.
Thank you, Samiksha. Great, so I have the pleasure of actually being able to walk through the system strategy framework. This is the output of phase 2 of the system strategy efforts. The strategy framework articulates a shared vision and path for accelerating progress as a collective ecosystem. So as you're going to see, the strategy covers many different components of a well-functioning ecosystem. It's not intended to be a strategy for a single organization, but rather provides a vision for collective action that requires many organizations, individuals, entities to be operating in collaboration and coordination to deliver. It's also inclusive of many different, what we're calling initiatives for action and investment. We want to provide today an introductory tour of the system strategy. So as you can imagine, as Samiksha mentioned, this has been a very ambitious project and process. And so the scope of the strategy is very expansive. We wanted to make sure that we were spending a little bit of time just introducing the various components of the strategy. And so we're going to do our best to try and talk through some of the analysis and critical thinking that got us to this strategy, that sits under the strategy itself. But we're certainly not going to have time to cover sort of that full breadth of analysis in the 90 minutes that we have today. But the goal here is really just to ensure that there's broad familiarity with the system strategy, and in particular, the set of initiatives that we're going to speak to, because those are, as Samiksha mentioned, the focus of phase 3 as we start thinking about implementation. So the system strategy framework has 4 overall layers. And before I start speaking to each of these pieces, I just wanted to give a little bit of context to the sort of larger picture of the strategy framework itself. At the top, you see we have a set of 3 principles that serve to inform the complex choices and strategic trade-offs that are called for in the system strategy. Early in the process, it became very clear that we would need a set of principles that could serve as a bit of a guiding North Star in terms of choice making and navigating some of these trade-offs that are inherent in a system strategy that by nature is complex. Beneath that, we have 4 pathways. These pathways are areas that have been identified that are defined as key areas where transformation is required. These pathways provide an important structure for the strategy. They allow us to define the specific interconnected areas of focus. As I walk through the pathways, many of them are going to feel familiar to you because they're existing areas where the ecosystem is already operating. There might be some new frames or kind of a lens in terms of how we're thinking about each of these pathways. But by and large, they're sort of important parts of creating a structure around the strategy framework for us to extend. Beneath that, we have 3 enablers that have been defined. These really are around kind of articulating the mindset and collective resources that are needed to accelerate progress towards universal access. So here's where we start to explore some enablers like funding and financing that really are sort of critical to driving transformations across the 4 pathways. So we have the set of principles that define the North Stars that guide choices. We have the pathways and enablers that create a shared structure for the strategy framework. And then the final layer is the initiatives, which actually define the specific areas of investment and action that the ecosystem should focus on today. So initiatives could include things like a platform, a tool, a campaign, a cultural or mindset shift, influencing and engagement strategies for key actors, funding efforts, etc. They are intentionally diverse. So they cover the full spectrum of the enablers that are articulated in the strategy. Many of these initiatives build off existing efforts and momentum that already exist in the space today. And where we, through this process, have identified areas where we need to really focus on trying to mobilize new resources to scale up some of that process. Some of these initiatives are new areas as well. The list of initiatives, and we'll present them all in detail, but these are not meant to suggest that these are the only things that the ecosystem should be focusing on. So the set of initiatives that we're going to present really are kind of a list of areas that through this strategy development process were identified with stakeholders as places where we need to deploy more investment, attention, and efforts in order to unlock meaningful progress in the immediate term. But certainly there's many areas of effort that are happening in the ecosystem today that you might not see represented in a specific initiative. And that is not to say that those are not important areas of action, but rather that there's specific areas that we're focusing on through this process as we move forward. And also just wanted to note that the list doesn't include some future initiatives that become necessary and possible. So one of the important parts of our approach in thinking about selecting this list of initiatives is that we were very much thinking in terms of horizons. So not every ambition that we may have for the ecosystem is possible today, and not all things are necessary today. Instead, we tried to apply, as Dempna mentioned, that kind of lens of being practical, and wanting to make sure that we were thinking strategically and sort of surgically, as we keep saying as a team, where it's feasible and meaningful to focus resources today. And this allows us to think about securing progress that unlocks the potential for future initiatives. And so we've tried to explore these considerations with stakeholders to weigh some of the trade-offs and options as we've gone through. But certainly there might be ambitions that, as we start making progress, become possible or sort of feasible in the future. And so some of those things will sort of continue to need to be adapted. That's part of why we call the strategy a sort of living initiative. And then, as Samiksha mentioned, the initiatives really will be the focus of the next phase of this work, which is where we'll start thinking about actually building and testing and refining these initiatives and thinking about how we get them to a place where they are ready to launch. And so that will again include another process of bringing stakeholders into this process once again, really with the goal of trying to make sure that we're co-creating some of these initiatives along with the various stakeholders in the ecosystem. All right. So now just wanted to move on and kind of talk through each of these pieces. The first is the three overarching principles that we've defined. So the first principle is of self-determination, which recognizes the central authority that both national governments and individuals have in making decisions over their own future. So in the context of the strategy, that means that we are focused on optimizing for an ecosystem where national governments lead choice-making and have ownership over their national transitions, and where the international community supports and respects these choices. For individuals, that means putting users and their realities and needs at the center of how the ecosystem operates. And so you'll see that reflected as we start walking through the pathways. We heard from stakeholders, just to give a little bit of flavor into some of the conversations that we've been having. For example, kind of time and time again, that there's a lack often of end user voices, and that has repercussions for thinking about how the ecosystem scales and where progress can potentially be made. The second principle focuses on equitable and just outcomes, which recognizes the fundamental right of all to cook with healthy, safe, and affordable solutions. And so that means that we have to address some of the tensions and trade-offs that are inherent to achieving universal access to clean cooking and net emissions by 2050, and ensure pathways for just energy transitions that leave no one behind. So to get more precise, that means that we can't solve the climate crisis at the expense of other development priorities. We cannot ask households to bear the burden of climate crisis at the expense of their health. And so this also means that we have to take intentional steps to really ensure that no one is left behind. And so again, you'll see that reflected in the pathways as we start walking through those. And our final principle is one of systemic thinking. This has both been a part of our approach to this process, but it's also reflected in how the strategy has been created and defined. This essentially reflects the need to embrace a systems approach. And what that means is, as we think about advancing big solutions that are at the scale and reach of the challenges that they're designed to address, we have to think deeply about how the system operates as a whole and connects with other systems. And so this means thinking about how we find ways to dismantle negative reinforcing cycles, replace them with healthier ones, understanding some of the root causes of challenges, shifting some of the power dynamics that exist, and mindsets to be more productive. And so as we walk through this, you'll see that there are places within the strategy itself where we really are trying to focus on initiatives that can do all of these things. And so as you'll see here in some of the quotes that sort of reflect the importance of kind of taking a systems lens, we heard sort of time and time again thinking about how cook stoves and clean cooking is a space that really can contribute to any of the sustainable development goals, which I think just reflects sort of the multi-sectoral nature of clean cooking as an issue, and the importance of making sure that we're thinking about connecting to and building bridges to other adjacent sectors and communities. And also thinking about how we have to think about kind of the full sort of value chain and sort of spectrum of pieces that matter when thinking about the clean cooking space. Next, I'm going to talk through the 4 interconnected pathways. So once again, these are the areas that where transformation is required. And so the first pathway, national governments lead clean cooking transitions. Here you'll see that we're embracing the principle of self-determination. And so the role of governments has really been prioritized as an area of emphasis within the system strategy. The ecosystem has to adjust power dynamics and address some of the risk and barriers for national governments to lead these transitions. And so this means that there's local ownership and self-determination over the solutions that are most appropriate and how to think about delivering those access over time. And it requires really mobilizing the international and domestic resources and support that can translate political will and commitments into meaningful and effective action. The second pathway focuses on requiring households demanding clean cooking that meets their needs. And so this really is sort of the user-centric piece that we were speaking to within the principles. The user experience really needs to be central to and reflected in all decision-making, from thinking about shaping policies, national plans, to driving product and business model innovation, and thinking about how we develop a deeper and richer understanding of the user experience and designing the for users as sort of the center of everything that we think about doing. That means having a deeper understanding of how we shift stacking behaviors towards cleaner solutions. It means thinking about integrating smart meters and other digital technologies that can help us track real-time usage. And certainly there's a lot of exciting initiatives that are already happening in this particular space. Third, we require sustainable markets to deliver clean and affordable solutions. So again, reflecting on the principle of equitable and just outcomes, the journey to universal access requires a phased approach that acknowledges a diverse set of solutions is likely required and that incremental steps will be necessary. And so this means that while we might think about trying to leapfrog populations onto solutions that are clean at the point of use, when and where possible, there are other communities where a phased approach is also required, and thinking about how we transition through interim solutions that might be appropriate. Embedded in this particular pathway around sustainable markets is actually 3 trajectories. So early in this process, we were often asked if we were going to focus on certain technologies or fuels. And that wasn't the ambition of the strategy, again, because we are trying to think about this from an ecosystem perspective. But it was important, I think, to just articulate different trajectories that are possible around some of these different solution areas. And so just to share a little bit about each of those pathways, the first is that efforts need to be made to rapidly expand access to clean fuels that have already proven scalability in the energy sector to reach as many people as possible. And so obviously the 2 primary solutions here are electricity and LPG. At the same time, we have to be thinking about investing in efforts to rapidly prove the viability of other promising solutions, and then support growth where we can show commercial or even near commercial viability for large user segments. And so there we're thinking about things like ethanol, advanced biomass. And again, at the same time, we also have to think about significantly improving the quality and performance of improved cook stoves that can deliver improved and cleaner solutions. And all 3 of these pathways are sort of critical at the same time. And so we're very much thinking within the strategy about making progress across each of those 3 trajectories, not necessarily prioritizing one over the other. And then finally, underpinning all of these is the final pathway around leaving no households out. This really is, again, focusing on equitable and just outcomes. This means that we have to think about addressing some of the barriers of affordability, of physical reach, and really needing to think about how we can be bold, but also very much intentional here. And so we did think it was important to actually articulate this as a pathway within the strategy, because we really felt that it was important to acknowledge that clean cooking is a human rights issue akin to water, sanitation services, et cetera, that we need to think about clean cooking as a merit good. And by doing that, we open up the potential to really think about how there might be a role for appropriate, smart, equitable subsidy programs, and how we think about some of these intentional efforts that are required that ensure that last mile households are always included in any progress and efforts that we're undertaking.
Thanks, Lindsay. Maybe I can jump in here and just add two other reflections. During the process of this, developing the framework, we got a couple of questions about whether one of the pathways should be prioritized over another. And I think just a point to emphasize here is that the pathways are indeed interconnected, and progress across them is important, because our thinking as part of the systems approach is that no single pathway can deliver universal access to clean cooking. They need to progress in unison. For example, as Lindsay was describing, for no households to be left out or to be left behind, there's an important role for government in terms of policy and priority, understanding the needs of different end user segments and where they are and what the pathways are to access to clean cooking, what smart subsidy programs look like. For market solutions to be viable, there needs to be a stable policy environment, one that can attract private investment and private innovation. And so for us, I think it was important to emphasize that all of these pathways need to be, there needs to be progress under each of them for us to get where we would like to go. And then I think another important point that came out in some of our consultations is this agreement that getting to a final North Star and universal access will require a phased approach under each of these pathways. And so as part of the analysis, we have identified a few horizons, which are essentially phases of work. I think progress across the horizons will very much depend on the investment we collectively make today. And so to kind of echo the point Lindsay was making, that's where for us, the initiatives come in. We're really trying to highlight and galvanize action and investment and commitment around these initiatives, because we see these as key levers that can unlock progress across the pathways and can put us on faster trajectories where there are increased opportunities to move more quickly across the pathways and across the horizons. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you for that. Great. So just wanted to also share some of the quotes from stakeholders that we received during this process that gives just a little bit of insight into some of the perspectives that help shape some of these pathways. So it was common kind of time and time again that we heard just around the importance and priority of government action and leadership. That was very much a common theme in the discussions that we were having. And you'll see a quote here about how it's critical to get governments to prioritize clean cooking on their own and make them see that clean cooking is a big issue. I think this point around clean cooking relative to sort of other government priorities or other priorities of the international community came up time and time again, and really thinking about how we sort of make that case around the issue of clean cooking relative to other issues. We also heard often from enterprises as well, thinking about the importance of government policy and how that really can shape and have sort of a large impact over uptake of clean cooking solutions. We heard a lot of organizations that were starting to kind of shift their thinking into a little bit more of a systems approach, and in terms of thinking more about how they kind of influence the whole supply chain, or how they think about working across many different components, similar to the pathways themselves. So thinking not just how they focus on kind of one issue or one particular part, but maybe working across different pathways, which is certainly a feature of the pathways, as Samiksha was mentioning. Some of the analysis and thinking that we've been doing that sits underneath those is really around the interconnectivity across them. And so, part of thinking about leaving no household behind really requires government leadership that governments play an important role for setting up and sort of supporting markets, that the user experience really should be a foundational way that we build sustainable markets. And so all of those pieces very much interconnected. And I think we heard from many people an appetite and interest in really being able to think about the system as a whole as part of this process. We heard just another quote here, just to give a little bit of insight around thinking about making sure that end users are part of the design and feedback loop, making sure that that's a big part of how we think about the ecosystem functioning. So again, obviously, lots of conversations and many more quotes that we could share here to provide additional context, but just wanted to share a few to give some insight into the conversations we've been having. Great, so in addition to these pathways, we then have a set of the critical enablers. These critical enablers get to kind of 3 different areas that were particularly important in thinking about driving progress across the pathways. And so we have here the first enabler around building a culture around data and knowledge sharing, as well as adaptive learning. There's a lot of, I think, exciting initiatives, as I mentioned, happening around data, around knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, and really thinking about how we shift towards a culture that really that really drives and enables innovation. And so that means thinking about things about how we embrace and actually incentivize and learn from failure, that becomes an important part of the innovation process. So for example, we heard some quotes here about data and thinking about with smart meters, how there's now this ability to generate millions of data points, and really thinking about being able to identify customer usage and when maybe customers are not using, and how that allows to be able to track customer usage over time, and that this is really kind of a big fundamental shift that's happening in the space right now, and really is sort of one of the enablers that can drive a lot of future and exciting progress in this space. The second enabler is around embracing new and louder voices to champion clean cooking. And so this is about building a community of allies from adjacent spaces that can help champion clean cooking, engaging more local voices in communities where clean cooking access needs to be expanded. This is about supporting more government champions within government, for example. And so really thinking about how we embrace and elevate and connect to maybe voices that haven't always been as sort of prioritized in the space before. And then the third is around larger pools of funding and financing. And so thinking about how we unlock diverse pools of funding, of financing, making critical investments in innovation, risk-taking, enabling more equitable access, and then where possible, thinking about how we scale up successes. So we wanted to just share this again as sort of a brief overview of some of the structure of the strategy itself. And then now we wanted to just start transitioning a little bit into the initiatives. This is really where we start getting a little bit more specific about the how. So as I mentioned, the principles, the pathways and the enablers really do create kind of the structure to the strategy, but a lot of the meat, and I think what's going to be particularly interesting to this audience, is thinking about these specific initiatives that are coming out of this process. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague, Oren.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, everybody who's joining us today. I wanted to walk through the 19 initiatives that the team is proposing and has started to develop. I promise we will have some opportunities for folks to provide their feedback and comments during the webinar. I realize we're talking at you all quite a bit, so appreciate patience with that. And please do continue to ask questions in the Q&A function on the webinar itself, and we'll try to address some of those as we go. And those that we can't get to, we'll get back to individuals after the webinar. So let me walk through the initiatives here. As was mentioned a few times from Samiksha and Lindsay in particular, these are some starting points, specific areas for investment or action that we believe can drive meaningful results and impact across the ecosystem, and really connected to the four pathways that Lindsay went through a moment ago. And so we see these as really helping to unlock type of momentum across those pathways. These initiatives are quite diverse. Some of them are tools, some are campaigns or platforms, influencing strategies, even things such as mindset changes or cultural changes that we think are important for the ecosystem to embrace. And they've really come out of the stakeholder engagement over the past several months as we try to unpack and really dive into what are the changes that we think are important for the ecosystem to be pursuing and really investing in. And there is a time dimension to these. We think many of these are for really immediate focus. There might be other initiatives not included here that are also important, or that various parts of the ecosystem many of you on this webinar are pursuing today. And so this is not meant to be everything that needs to happen. It's just meant to be some areas where we think are important to really focus and prioritize and think strategically in the near term. And they all come with different considerations and trade-offs that we think are important for the ecosystem to take forward. And as Dimphna mentioned as we kicked off, this is really in a way a starting point. So we've articulated these initiatives collectively with the stakeholders that we've engaged with over the months. But really now the work of building these out begins. And so you'll see some early thinking on how to bring these to life in a few specific initiatives, and recognizing that there's quite a bit of work to be done across the ecosystem.
Oren, if I could jump in, maybe sharing a couple of the questions that we've gotten online so that hopefully you can speak to them in the next section. One was around how we can create a value chain network that incorporates everybody across the globe, where solutions meet markets with ease, which I think some of the initiatives touch upon. There was another couple of questions encouraging us to maintain a technology agnostic approach, and asking for additional specifics and remarks around how we plan on tackling various technology classes in our messaging moving forward. And so I think maybe if we can speak to some of that. And then finally, another interesting question was really around affordability. And as we think about leaving no household out, what does that mean for those households living under the poverty line? And specifically, people have discussed the situation in Nigeria, the situation in Cameroon, and how we really plan to mobilize around that as well.
Okay, great. We'll try to cover some of those as we go through. Right. So the first set of initiatives fall under this enabler that Lindsay spoke to around creating really a culture of data sharing, adaptive learning, and innovation, and what are the various things that are required to support that culture. And so there are 7 initiatives here, and these are not meant to be in a particular prioritized order. We think all of these are important to take on. The first on this list is launching a user insights lab. This is a type of a platform that's designed to really uncover and integrate user-centric insights. So really trying to understand end users, whether it's households or institutions that are ultimately the end users of clean cooking, and thinking about new methods, whether it's human-centered design or behavioral science, other behavioral science methods, the integration of better data on usage. All of these coming together in a platform of sorts to really drive both product development, service development from the enterprise side, but also shaping and informing national policies and national energy transition plans, and including subsidies. So how do we design smart subsidies that don't distort markets too much? How do we target those subsidies to the right needs of users, to the ways in which households think about stacking of multiple fuels within their usage? And so really doubling down on the types of insights that we need to have as an ecosystem to solve and address the opportunity around clean cooking. The second is thinking about digital technologies and integrating digital technologies much more within product and service models. So whether we're talking about smart meters or sensors or other ways to capture data, thinking about ways in which digital technology can be useful in order to enable funding and financing mechanisms, for example, results-based financing or carbon financing that traditionally have somewhat high monitoring and verification costs. So how can we bring those down through digital technologies? There's an affordability component here. How do we make clean cooking solutions more affordable by unlocking this type of financing? The third on this list is about thinking about regional testing centers and strengthening those, and also increasing the number of regional testing centers, making them more localized, increasing their capacity so that the quality of cooking solutions can increase and improve. We're thinking about developing tools and guides for decision making, in particular around national policy. So how do we support governments to think about the right enabling environment of stable policy, stable taxes and tariffs, but again, also toolkits for thinking of things such as subsidies for those to ensure that nobody's left behind. We are considering things such as innovation challenges, thinking about Global Cooking Innovation Challenge or different funds to really stimulate creative solutions, whether in humanitarian contexts or rethinking the way communities and housing structures are designed to support healthier, clean cooking. We're want to establish an evidence to action hub. This would be a knowledge center that's really designed to translate and bring to life all of the great research that's done across the ecosystem to really create data that is more actionable and more additive and can really drive and inform action, whether that's policy action or the development of better solutions. And finally, thinking about launching technology specific platforms. So there was a question about LPG. We also think there's a space to really increase the use of other clean fuels such as ethanol, and also advanced biomass such as pellets and briquettes. So really thinking about how do we advance these agendas around ethanol, around advanced biomass cooking solutions. What are the various business models, supply chains that need to come together for these to really thrive and flourish. So these are some of the initiatives that relate to a culture of data, learning, and innovation. Next slide, please. The next batch of initiatives really focus on activating and elevating champions, really supporting new and louder voices within the sector. So initiative around harnessing the momentum related to ongoing international events, whether it's the high-level dialogue on energy, whether it's the COP events that happen annually, the G7, the G20, the energy ministerials. There's quite a bit of momentum already around international events. So how do we really leverage that to elevate and champions for clean cooking through these important international events and really help shape collective efforts globally around clean cooking. We have an initiative to launch a network of delivery units that work within governments and provide dedicated support as well as funding to really advance the development and implementation of clean cooking plans or national energy plans. We have a vision of 10, maybe 20 countries coming together in a network, peers learning from each other about what are the best methods to really advance and accelerate clean cooking at the national level. We want to really elevate clean cooking within the agendas of leading development finance institutions and multilateral banks. So having a clean cooking finance campaign really to coordinate and elevate the importance of clean cooking as part of a equitable and just climate transition. So that's connected as well to the financing campaign, but also really targeting a clean cooking for climate campaign, given that clean cooking can really address so many important drivers of climate change. We think it's important to really bring in and engage the private sector, whether it's industry groups, industry associations, as part of the solution space, and whether that's the LPG industry, but also thinking about the power sector more broadly, as well as other industries that can contribute funding, talents, advocacy around clean cooking. We want to really grow local champions at the national level, thinking about bringing together communities locally, whether it's medical communities or the gender community, the livelihoods communities, various ways to really grow and nurture and cultivate local champions, whether it's national or subnational level. Thinking about bringing those various communities together as allies. And then finally here, thinking about clean cooking more in terms of mindset shifts and really establishing clean cooking as a human rights issue, and thinking about what that means from a global and local advocacy perspective to make sure that an opportunity as important as clean cooking gets the attention that it deserves within the broader human rights community as well. I know I'm going kind of quickly here. We want to make some time to go deeper into a few of these and get some of your thoughts on them as well. And then the final group here of initiatives fall under the critical enabler related to unlocking larger pools of funding and financing. We think it's important to push on results-based financing in particular. And so there's an initiative to establish an RVF Accelerator program to really invest in results-based financing, including carbon financing, to make the clean cooking ecosystem a bigger part of that market, to really improve the credibility for outcome buyers and financiers and investors, and importantly, to reduce some of the transaction costs and setup costs associated with some of these mechanisms to make them a bigger part of the solution. And we see this as a critical way to bring affordability around clean cooking for a greater subset of the population. We think it's important to create new funding paradigms, again, thinking about both ways in which to bring concessionary capital to scale, other ways to bring blended finance facilities and funds to support early stage clean cooking enterprises. Think about changing the ways that we think about the risks and the rewards associated with funding and financing. So what is the new paradigm for funding that we think is important? So that relates to both blended finance, but also different new funding paradigms that we think are important to bring about. Again, speaking to some of the mindset shifts that we think are important to infuse within the sector. And then a few other ways to bring in the private sector. So thinking about a coalition of private companies that can come together to fund clean cooking efforts, whether through corporate social responsibility initiatives or in order to meet their own corporate carbon reduction goals, as we see more and more international companies thinking about their commitments to a net zero climate carbon agenda. How do we connect them to opportunities for them to invest in and support the growth of clean cooking enterprises as part of those carbon reduction goals? And then the last initiative here is thinking about really how do we best engage and strengthen supply chains much more broadly to include some of the smaller producers, whether they're artisans or whether they're small enterprises. In many ways, these are the foundation of clean and improved cooking solutions in many parts of the world. And they are entrepreneurs, enterprises that are today delivering clean or improved solutions in many ways. And how do we strengthen those supply chains and really help them reach some of the harder to reach households to make sure that no household is really left behind. So this was meant to be a bit of a fast overview of the 19 initiatives. We're going to go a bit deeper into a few of these. I'll hand that over to Lindsay to walk us through some of those, and then there's some opportunities to engage many of you on those as well.
Thank you, Oren. And there's actually a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A window that I wanted to just address quite quickly. So someone asked if around the bolding of some of the initiatives that were on the slides. So we've actually been thinking about this in a bit of a phased approach. Obviously, a list of 19 things is quite long to sort of think about how we start moving all of those towards implementation at once. And so what we've started doing is thinking about if there's maybe a set of those that we can focus on in a bit of kind of waves. And so the ones that were bolded there were some of the ones that we're starting to focus on now. And then there'll be additional waves of initiatives that are coming after. We had another question around the Clean Cooking Finance campaign, which is focused on DFIs and multilateral development banks. And so thinking about how we might engage them more deeply in this space as a potential source of funding, but also as a as sort of allies and thinking about the role that they can potentially play in terms of helping shape government agendas. So that was who the Clean Cooking Finance campaign was focused on. And then I think we'll kind of keep watching. I don't want to get us too far behind on time, but we'll keep trying to answer these as they keep coming through. Great. So we wanted to just share a little bit more around a few of the initiatives. And again, we could probably spend hours on a webinar giving all of the context and details around the full list. And unfortunately, we won't have time to do that. We do hope to be able to come out with, you can check the website and actually see the long list of initiatives that we have there with a little bit of a description for each, but we are hoping to share a little bit more around each of them as we continue to move forward. But for today, just wanted to introduce a couple that are in this sort of first wave of sorts of some of the implementation work that we're thinking about doing now. So we're going to try and make this a little bit interactive and give all of you an opportunity to give some input on these. So if you're able to go to menti.com, you can put in this code. I'll maybe ask someone from our team to just drop that into the chat so that you're still able to access it. We're going to talk through a couple of specific initiatives one by one, and then after each initiative, we'll pause and have just a poll question for all of you to fill out. So I would suggest that maybe you just keep the Menti poll open in a separate window because we'll come back to it a couple of times. Great. So the first one we're going to start with is the RVF Accelerator. And I think I saw a Q&A question asking something around what the timelines for the launch of the RVF Accelerator would be. So I'll try and answer that as I'm sort of talking through this one. So the RVF Accelerator, the Results-Based Financing Accelerator, is an initiative to think about how we accelerate the use of results-based financing, including carbon finance, as part of the clean cooking space. And to a couple of the challenges that came up sort of time and time again in our conversations, we're thinking about how we make this space more credible for outcome buyers, particularly around verification and kind of standardizing some of the pricing and verification methodologies. And then also thinking about how we reduce the transaction cost. And so there's obviously a lot happening right now and a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around RVF, but often there's maybe a lack of transparency around some of these, around some of the things around like methodologies and verification methodologies, and sort of thinking through some of the specifics that really could kind of create public goods for the space around RVF. So a large part of the accelerator is thinking about how do we kind of make some of that into a public good, but also thinking about where there's opportunity for us to really be pushing on innovation and learning around RVF mechanisms, and thinking about how we ensure that RVFs are maybe being used for different types of technologies and sort of around different types of outcomes, and really thinking about how we push the bounds of maybe what is already happening with results-based financing today. And so just to talk through a little bit of some of the specifics around what the RVF Accelerator would do is thinking about how it establishes and leads on an innovation and applied research agenda. So this is identifying some of the questions and unknowns that exist around RVF today, and thinking about how we maybe set up pilots or create learning opportunities to really be able to answer some of those questions. Developing cost-effective and reliable verification methodologies, and where those things already exist, thinking about how we create a public good out of them. There's a lot of people, I think, that are focusing on answering some of these issues maybe in sort of silos or in sort of specific areas, and thinking about how we elevate that to a place where it's more accessible and there's more transparency around what's happening in the space. And then thinking about how we promote the impact and credibility and innovation to outcome buyers. Again, I mentioned earlier that a common thread that we heard was people speaking to how clean cooking sort of stands up relative to other areas that governments might prioritize or where funders might prioritize, and thinking about what it takes to really make sure that the clean cooking space becomes an area for where RVF is happening in a way that is kind of impactful and exciting and innovative, so that it appeals to outcome buyers. From a timeline perspective, so this is one of the ones that we're thinking about in kind of the first wave of implementation. And so what that means right now is we're going to open this process up a little bit to stakeholders, bring them in, and really think about getting a very clear sense of kind of mapping out what is already happening in the RVF space, co-creating that innovation and applied research agenda that I spoke to. So really trying to understand what is it that the ecosystem is trying to answer and solve for, who is already answering and solving for that, and where are there gaps where we can think about contributing and driving some of the learning and innovation a little bit further. And so over the next couple of months, that's the focus of the work, which then I think gets us to a place by hopefully later this year where we're in a position to start thinking about a potential launch or maybe bringing to life at least a part of the RVF Accelerator. Great, so I'm gonna ask everyone to maybe go over to their Menti. And we have a question for everyone to give some input and feedback into, which is, what questions do we need to answer for RVF to meaningfully unlock investment in clean cooking? Oh, and we're already getting some exciting inputs here. So thinking about how we potentially de-risk, I would say that's another common one that we often heard. Allowing subsidies to final consumers is another one that's actually a particular interest to me, is thinking about how we make sure that RVFs don't just focus on the places where they're kind of easy or feasible today, but really thinking about how we push where it is that they go. Again, I think in a similar vein, thinking about how RVF can be flexible enough to address some of the affordability challenges. How RVF will connect with the Clean Cooking Fund, I think, is an interesting one. Again, on this sort of question of kind of transparency and making a public good out of some of these learnings that we heard time and time again. How can we make digital verification methodologies for monitoring usage cheaper? That's actually another one of the initiatives that Warren spoke to that I think is actually very closely related to the RVF space. And I know there's some very exciting efforts that are happening here that a few organizations are involved in thinking about how we use digital tech. Great. These are really exciting, and unfortunately we won't have time to sit here and kind of go through all of them, but this is useful for us, and we'll sort of take this information and kind of put it into the learning agenda that we're thinking about capturing. And maybe what we can actually do too is share this long list of questions we'll send an email to everyone that just shares some of the presentation materials, but we can add these as well so people can see what others are asking.
Hey, Lindsay. Oh, go ahead.
Oh. Clearly, we're all very excited about this one. The questions really highlight for me just how interconnected all the different elements are across the initiatives. And so I think it's really exciting to see these questions come in, because this is not just a standalone thing as an RVF accelerator. It also speaks to the knowledge, and it also speaks to the making sure we learn from failure, and it speaks to climate financing and other things. So I think those questions really highlight the interconnectedness of all the different elements of the strategy. So that's really great to see those.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim, for that. Great, so the next one that we wanted to speak through is an initiative that we're calling the Delivery Units Network. And so the Delivery Units Network is a dedicated fund or technical support hub that's seeking to support the establishment of governmental clean cooking delivery teams in 10 or more countries. And these delivery teams would have the mandate and resources to lead clean cooking transitions. Another element of the Delivery Unit Network is thinking about a platform or mechanism that we can think about supporting and growing entrepreneurs within government. So we heard a common theme coming out that really government ownership requires that we make a very strong case for clean cooking as an area for political success, for the success of national governments, and thinking about if we can support the creation of entrepreneurs that can really own the clean cooking mandate within government. And that really it comes down to having talented individuals that are willing to own this issue within the context of government. And then also thinking about how we build a network of peers across national government delivery units. I think this one's particularly exciting because this is actually, there have been some cases of efforts to set up these clean cooking teams that we can kind of build off of and move forward with. But just to give a little bit of context around some of the thinking around why this is critical, that obviously the pathway we spoke about for national governments is a really fundamental part of the overall strategy, but also that there really needs to be kind of a whole of government approach and really thinking about making it sort of clear who the kind of nodal point and sort of owner or leader is within the context of a national government over the issue of clean cooking. Also creating platforms for peer-to-peer networks where governments can learn from one another and kind of share best practices and learnings and insights that are coming out of the work that they're doing. And then thinking about how we reorient the international community to operate in support of and through these kind of nodal government delivery teams that exist within government. So really thinking about how we kind of restructure the way that the ecosystem operates to that extent. And so this includes a little bit of just the funding and technical support needed to think about how we create some of these governmental teams and thinking about the sort of targeted campaigns across maybe a particular region or a set of countries to help kind of support and incentivize the creation of these teams. We have another question for the Minty poll that we wanted to get some input on, which is which countries would find a delivery unit network most useful and why? As part of the next phase of this process, the delivery unit network will be one that will be part of the first wave of initiatives that we're focused on. And so we're quite keen to start thinking about how we actually engage national governments in this process and thinking about which countries we could potentially focus on that might be interested in such an initiative. So I'm seeing one around East Africa, thinking about what I assume is kind of thinking about how we build and harness some of the momentum that's already happening there. The East Africa region and Southeast Asia region as well. That there might be some interest in Cameroon. Along with the countries that have already been active in creating cook stove standards. Nepal, I know there's a lot of exciting work happening with the government there on a couple of different fronts. See some for Kenya, Chad. None of them that require propane. Great. Some momentum that's happening in Malawi that we could potentially build upon. Great. Okay, so in the spirit of time and just making sure that we're able to get through, I'm just going to move on to the final one, which is the User Insight Lab. So the User Insight Lab is an open platform lab that is focused on deploying behavioral science and human-centered design methodologies, as well as leveraging some of the exciting initiatives that are happening around lean data and around big data as a means to unlock deeper 360 view of the user experience. This includes everything from thinking about fuel stacking transitions to really understanding affordability, and then thinking about how we use those insights as a way to inform the sort of 360 elements that matter when we think about designing for end users. And so that includes both product and service innovation, but also around policy making, the design of subsidies, the design of behavior change campaigns, and really thinking about how we kind of build all of those things together around a single user. The elements of what the lab would do is thinking about how we apply behavior science and human-centered design research directly to enterprises, or as a means to kind of create a better disaggregation and understanding of end users. Again, integrating lean and big data, and that the lab ideally would become a bit of a source for thought leadership on user insights. So whatever information is being generated within the lab becomes a bit of a public good that is shared more widely with the ecosystem to sort of allow everyone to benefit from some of the insights that are coming out from user research. Certainly the application of HCD and behavioral science techniques within the clean cooking space is not new, but what we often heard through conversations is that the learnings of these things often happen in silos, and that maybe there's a way for us to think about doing this as more of a public good broadly. And then we have a Menti poll for this one as well. Would love to hear who you think could potentially benefit most from access to end user insights. And so who we should be thinking about in the context of the User Insight Lab is a potential customer or user of the insights that are being generated. So we're seeing government, enterprises, I think is a common one, thinking about how we deepen understanding around things like stacking transitions, usage, disusage, and how we do that in ways in which real-time data collection is too expensive or potentially too challenging. I see policies, governments, the delivery units network that we were just speaking to as a potential kind of consumer of some of these insights. That we could think of across the sort of chain from end users themselves to donors and the general public, which I think is a great articulation of the ambition of the User Insight Lab, which is, I think that we're coming in with the lens that it's not about kind of any single user, but thinking about how we influence kind of the entire value chain around a single household or sort of user. In the context of humanitarian challenges, which is great to hear because one of the other initiatives on our list is actually thinking about design innovation challenges in the context of humanitarian context. Great. These are useful and certainly inputs that will be, I think, very important for us as we start thinking about phase 3, where we're really kind of sharpening some of our perspectives around some of these questions. These inputs that you're sharing over the Menti poll will be really, really helpful in kind of shaping that. All right. And then before I hand it off, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time speaking about our phase 3 and what that is going to look like. We've mentioned a couple of times that the emphasis of phase 3 is really thinking about building and testing some of the initiatives that are on the long list that we shared. And as I mentioned, we're thinking about doing that in a little bit of a rolling process. So what that means is that we'll be kind of thinking about specific initiatives in waves rather than thinking about and focusing on all 19 at once. The approach here really is to kind of co-create alongside partners and alongside various stakeholders in the space. That means bringing in stakeholders once again to the process to really help us design, refine, and iterate in real time, so that we're making sure that the outputs that are coming out around these initiatives really reflects the realities of the ecosystem. So I'm sure many people on this call will be reaching out to all of you, and some of the questions that we have in our survey is an ask to all of you to help us identify what organizations should be involved in the co-creation process around a lot of these specific initiatives. But the emphasis really is thinking about how we take these from ideas to actually kind of inception and moving them across to a place where we're ready to actually start launching some of these exciting initiatives that have been identified. So we do hope to try and once again, engage a diverse set of stakeholders and really involve as many people in the process as we possibly can. And so we'll really be looking to all of you in the survey that we've shared or will share to give us some inputs on which organizations you think should be involved in all of that.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Speaking of partner organizations with whom we will most likely be co-creating, I am so delighted that Banjira has joined us today and has been just an invaluable full partner for myself and for the organization for this process. So Banjira, just wondered if you could share with all of us and the people listening in as well, just your thoughts about the strategy and as another leading organization in the energy transition space, what stands most out to you at this moment?
Well, thank you, Dimfna, and to your team, really, congratulations. This is remarkable, and such a, I haven't actually spent as much time as I used to in the cooking space, and to see just how much has evolved and developed is remarkable. It strikes me that it's a real moment of opportunity for the clean cooking sector, especially at this time with all the shocks we're going through. Elevating this issue as a global priority is ripe. And Dimfna, you and I are sitting on a number of fora where we see this to be true. There's a new interest, but for decades, this issue has just not received the sort of attention it deserves, the funding it deserves. And that matches essentially the magnitude of the challenge. And we continue to talk about it. But I think we are getting a lot more granular about what we understand, where the points of intervention are. And I think we have an opportunity, in part through this systems strategy, to change the trajectory of SDG 7, actually. And that I think is really important. There's so much happening around that is creating opportunities for clean cooking. You have NDCs being crafted as we speak, and this is definitely an opportunity for countries to invest in clean cooking in this sector. We have global dialogues. So we're part of a lot of the high-level dialogue on energy and other issues around energy as well, moving very quickly. And you know, we find ourselves discussing this issue more than we have across different sectors. WRI, this issue is extremely ripe, especially around, as you said, the energy transition. I'm just really happy to hear that this strategy has started to influence dialogues in different places, even calls to action. I know that there are a few that we are familiar with. So I just think the principles are really exciting to me. I'm especially excited about the just transition, obviously, but the mindset one. I've been talking about a mindset change and mindset shifts around this sector, but also around different issues, just how much we have to stop and understand, whether it's urbanization, cooking, the energy for industrialization. There's a shift that has to happen for us to unlock the real potential for action. Because we've been talking about ambition for a long time, but for action, we really do need that mindset shift. So those are some of the things I feel are so exciting in this, Dimfna. Over to you.
No, thank you, Banjira. And I think you and I speak a lot about the principle of self-determination as well, and how that relates to national governments, especially also as we think about some governments that are transitioning in Africa. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how that fits with you and sort of the initiatives where you see that show up strongly.
Well, one of the areas that has been real and exciting in a way is we've been talking about how important air quality is and the issue of air quality. But now with COVID-19 and the reality of the underlying health, that your underlying health predisposes you in different ways has made this issue of clean cooking essentially a critically important one. What are the sources of air pollution, and where are we getting, where are the opportunities to respond to that? We have new allies in ministers of health who previously were not that interested. This was an issue and purview for the Ministry of Energy. And all of a sudden, ministers of health are saying, we need to make sure that our populations can withstand shocks like this. And that, I think, is a new opportunity that everybody, the entire world together, stopping because of this pandemic. And air quality has something to do with our ability to be resilient, to overcome. And I think that presents some really unique opportunities, that even as we recover, as we build forward better, that we actually look at opportunities that will not increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know that that is the big challenge. So that, to me, is very exciting and a new exciting opportunity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the concept of the delivery unit speaks to that, Wanjira, because there are so many impacts, as we all know, that could be addressed with clean cooking. The ability to provide additional focus on it through the concept of the delivery unit at the government level, we're hoping will really significantly transform the path forward for different countries as we continue to strengthen their energy plans and energy transition plans, including for clean cooking. I am conscious of our time, and especially your time, Wanjira, as I know you have an important call coming up. So I want to make sure that we wrap up. Anything else you wanted to share, Wanjira?
Just not really, just to say how much I appreciate the work you all do in this area. Energy and the energy transition around for cooking, and of course energy for industrialization around the continent is a big issue. For those of us who are working on the poverty agenda, eliminating poverty, rural transformation, this is at the heart.
All right. I think we may have lost Wanjira a little bit. I also know that she has to jump onto another call. So I think with that, if that's the case, Samiksha and Lindsay, we can wrap it up and finalize this conversation. A few specific asks from us, as we've already mentioned. We will share a short survey with everybody to fill in and let us know how you would like to be engaged, and or other organizations can be engaged. And then in the coming months, we will definitely be reaching out to many of you to help with building out some of these concepts and co-create in that process with us. So be watching for that outreach as well. We'll try to engage as many organizations as possible within the time and sort of how you co-create in this particular process. We are also hoping that some of you will be able to directly support the implementation, as I was sharing already with WRI and other organizations. Definitely opportunities to start implementing some of these together with many of our partners. And then finally, we really hope that you see this as a shared strategy that includes embracing the language, the concepts, the initiatives that we shared, so that we collectively all own this strategy going forward. So I think those are my call to action for now. And maybe we can end with sharing two quotes that we thought would be helpful for everybody to see. One on the left from the Minister for International Development from Norway, that really speaks to the timing of this strategy and why it is so critically important. And the second one from Damilola, the head of SE for All and the special representative for the UN, as all of you know. We need to focus and use this moment in time to accelerate progress on clean cooking, which, as Wanjira was also alluding to, is critically important at this moment in time. So with that, Lindsay and Samiksha, unless there's anything else you would like to share, Samiksha?
I just wanted to say we appreciate all the questions that we received. We'll be sharing out the presentation, the recording, and we will be sharing out the questions and making sure that we follow up with those that we didn't get to today, but very much appreciate it, and we will be following up.
Great. Thank you everybody for participating, for dialing in, for sharing your questions. As we mentioned, you will be hearing from us in the weeks and months ahead, and we're very excited about how this can really change the sector forward. And so looking forward to continuing our collaboration and partnership with all of you. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.